This is the story of an emperor who conquered a continent and then waged a war for peace. It is the journey of a man who transformed from a ruthless tyrant into a benevolent ruler, a man whose legacy is etched not just in stone, but in the soul of a nation. This is the story of Ashoka the Great. In the 4th century before the Common Era, the Indian subcontinent was not a single entity. It was a vibrant, violent mosaic of competing kingdoms and republics. For centuries, this vast landmass, shielded by the Himalayas to the north and the great oceans to the south, had developed a complex civilization. But it was a civilization divided. From the fertile plains of the Ganges River to the rugged Deccan Plateau, power was fractured. These were the Mahajanapadas, the 16 great realms, constantly at war, forging temporary alliances and vying for supremacy. Kingdoms like Kosala, Avanti, and Gandhara rose and fell. But the center of gravity was shifting eastward to the powerful kingdom of Magadha in modern-day Bihar. Rich in iron ore and fertile soil and controlling lucrative riverine trade routes, Magadha was destined for greatness. Its rulers, the Nanda dynasty, were notoriously wealthy and commanded a formidable army. They were feared, but they were not loved. Their ambition was great, but a greater ambition was stirring in the west. In 326, before Common Era, a storm from Europe broke upon the borders of India. Alexander of Macedon, having conquered the mighty Persian Empire, led his weary but undefeated army across the Hindu Kush mountains and into the Punjab. He had heard tales of the riches of India, of its philosophical mysteries, and of its armies of elephants. The local rulers of the splintered western kingdoms were no match for the Macedonian phalanx and the tactical genius of its commander. Alexander fought and won a brutal battle at the Hydaspes River against King Porus, a victory so costly it shook the morale of his own troops. They had conquered the known world, but the prospect of facing the massive armies of the Nanda Empire, rumored to be many times the size of their own, was too much. His men mutinied. Alexander, frustrated and angry, was forced to turn back. He would die in Babylon a few years later, his Asian empire collapsing into warring factions led by his generals. Alexander's invasion was brief, a mere footnote in the long history of India, but its consequences were profound. His campaign had shattered the old power structures of the Northwest. It had exposed the vulnerability of divided kingdoms to a unified, determined foe, and it had created a chaotic power vacuum. It was in this crucible of uncertainty and opportunity that the Mauryan Empire was forged. Two figures dominate its founding, a young, ambitious upstart named Chandragupta Maurya and his mentor, a shrewd, ruthless Brahmin strategist named Chanakya, also known as Kautilya. The exact origins of Chandragupta are shrouded in mystery. Some texts claim he was of royal lineage, others that he was a commoner. What is clear is that he possessed immense courage and a burning desire for power. Chanakya was a scholar and a teacher from the great university city of Taxila. Legend holds that he was insulted by the Nanda king, and in revenge he swore to destroy the dynasty. He saw in the young Chandragupta the perfect instrument for his ambition. Together, they were a formidable pair, the charismatic warrior and the master puppeteer. They began their campaign not in the heartland of Magadha, but on the periphery, in the lands recently destabilized by Alexander. Chandragupta raised an army, exploiting the local discontent and recruiting warriors from the fierce clans of the Punjab. He systematically defeated the remaining Greek garrisons and local rulers, consolidating his power in the northwest. With this new base secure, he turned his sights on the ultimate prize, the Nanda Empire and its capital, Pataliputra. The war against the Nandas was reputedly long and bloody. Chanakya's strategies, a blend of open warfare, guerrilla tactics, and intricate espionage, wore down the larger Nanda forces. Around 322 before Common Era, Chandragupta's army stormed Pataliputra. The Nanda king was overthrown and killed, and Chandragupta Maurya, the young adventurer from the frontiers, ascended the throne of Magadha. He was no longer just a king. He was the founder of a dynasty and the first emperor of a unified India. The Mauryan age had begun. The empire they built was unlike anything India had ever seen. It was a centralized, bureaucratic, military machine. The blueprint for this state is laid out in a remarkable political treatise, the Arthashastra, or the science of material gain. Attributed to Chanakya, it is a manual of statecraft devoid of morality. It is a cold, pragmatic guide to acquiring and holding power. The book details everything from tax collection and agricultural administration to the intricate workings of a vast spy network. It describes how to manage trade, build infrastructure, and conduct diplomacy. It also explains how to use propaganda, assassination, and treachery to crush dissent and eliminate rivals. For Chanakya, the ends always justified the means. The only goal was the stability and prosperity of the state, embodied by the king. The individual had little importance. Under the guidance of the Arthashastra, Chandragupta's empire grew relentlessly. Pataliputra, its capital, became one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world. A Greek ambassador, Megasthenes, who lived in the city for several years, left a detailed account of its splendor. He described a metropolis stretching for nearly 15 kilometers along the Ganges River, protected by a massive wooden palisade with 570 towers and 64 gates. The emperor's palace was said to rival the Persian palaces of Susa and Ecbatana in its opulence. The state was run by a complex hierarchy of ministers and superintendents, overseeing every aspect of public life. A standing army, the largest the world had yet seen, enforced the emperor's will. Megasthenes reported its numbers with awe: 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, 8,000 chariots, and 9,000 war elephants. This colossal force was not just for defense, it was the primary instrument of expansion. Chandragupta's conquests continued throughout his reign. He pushed west, back to the frontiers Alexander had crossed. There, he met a new rival, Seleucus, the first Nicator, Alexander's most successful general, who had carved out a vast empire for himself from the eastern remnants of Alexander's conquests. Around 305 before Common Era, the two titans clashed. The armies of the new Indian Empire faced the veterans of the Macedonian phalanx. The details of the conflict are scarce, but the outcome is not. Chandragupta was victorious. The subsequent peace treaty was a resounding Mauryan triumph. Seleucus ceded vast territories, including modern-day Afghanistan and parts of Pakistan, effectively setting the empire's northwestern border at the Hindu Kush Mountains. In return, Chandragupta gifted Seleucus 500 war elephants, a valuable military asset that the Greek general would later use to great effect in his own wars. The treaty was sealed with a marriage alliance, and diplomatic and commercial ties were established, formally linking India with the Hellenistic world. By the end of his reign, Chandragupta ruled an empire that stretched from the Bay of Bengal in the east to the mountains of Afghanistan in the west, from the Himalayas in the north down towards the Deccan Plateau in the south. He had achieved what no one before him had ever done. The political unification of nearly the entire Indian subcontinent was his accomplishment. He had built a state of unprecedented power and efficiency. It was a machine designed for conquest and control. However, this period of empire building was also an age of profound intellectual and spiritual questioning. The traditional religious landscape was dominated by Brahmanism, the forerunner of modern Hinduism. It was a religion of complex rituals and sacrifices presided over by the Brahmin priestly class. They held a privileged position in the social hierarchy defined by the caste or Varna system. This orthodox system, however, was being challenged by a wave of new philosophical movements, known collectively as the Shramanic traditions. These movements rejected the authority of the Brahmins and the efficacy of their rituals. They offered alternative paths to spiritual liberation, paths based on personal effort, asceticism, and philosophical inquiry. Two of these movements were gaining significant traction: Jainism and Buddhism. Jainism, championed by the teacher Mahavira, preached a path of extreme austerity and a radical doctrine of nonviolence, or ahimsa, which extended to all living beings, no matter how small. Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, offered a middle way between extreme indulgence and self-mortification. The Buddha taught that the root of all suffering was desire, and that suffering could be extinguished by following the noble eightfold path of right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Both of these faiths rejected the hereditary basis of the caste system and appealed to a growing number of people, from merchants and artisans to disenfranchised warriors, who were looking for new answers to life's oldest questions. The Mauryan Empire, for all its military and political focus, was a hotbed of this philosophical ferment. Chandragupta's end was as remarkable as his rise. According to Jain tradition, late in life, the great conqueror abdicated his throne in favor of his son, Bindusara. He renounced the world he had built, the power he had fought so hard to win, and became a Jain monk. He is said to have traveled south to Shravanabelagola in modern Karnataka, where he ended his life by fasting to death, the ultimate act of ascetic renunciation. The first emperor, the man who unified India through violence and cunning, chose a path of absolute peace in his final days. It was a startling act, one that hinted at the deep spiritual currents flowing just beneath the surface of his militaristic empire. His son, Bindusara, inherited a vast and stable state around 297 before Common Era. His reign is poorly documented compared to his father's and his son's, but it was far from uneventful. Known by the title Amitrochates, or Slayer of Foes, by the Greeks, Bindusara was a capable ruler who maintained the empire's powerful administrative and military structures. His primary focus was consolidation and southward expansion. He pushed the Mauryan frontiers deep into the Deccan, bringing almost the entire peninsula, save for the southernmost kingdoms of the Cholas, Pandyas, and Cheras, and a defiant state on the eastern coast called Kalinga, under Pataliputra's control. He maintained friendly relations with the Hellenistic world, exchanging ambassadors and luxury goods with the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. Bindusara's court was a center of learning and culture, home to philosophers from various schools of thought, yet the machinery of the state remained as ruthless as ever. The Arthashastra was still the guiding principle of governance. Rebellions, such as a major uprising in the city of Taxila, were crushed without mercy. The empire was a complex entity, a place of vibrant philosophical debate ruled by an iron fist. It was a state built for war that now largely enjoyed the fruits of a forced peace. Its economy was booming, its influence was unmatched, and its power seemed absolute. It was into this world that Bindusara's son was born, a prince of the most powerful dynasty India had ever known. He was raised not in a monastery, but in a palace built on the spoils of conquest. He was educated not in the doctrines of non-violence, but in the brutal calculus of the Arthashastra. He learned that power was paramount, that sentiment was a weakness, and that an empire was maintained by the same means it was forged with unrelenting force. He was taught to be a warrior, a general, and a governor. By the time Bindusara's long reign came to an end around 273 before Common Era, the Mauryan Empire was a colossal, stable, and fearsome power. It was the legacy this young prince was set to inherit. But the throne was not his by right. Bindusara had many sons, and the succession would not be peaceful. This prince would have to fight for it. He would have to prove that he was the most ruthless, the most capable, and the most worthy successor to the Mauryan legacy of blood and iron. His name was Ashoka. The Mauryan Empire was a creation of ruthless ambition, and it demanded rulers of the same mold. Ashoka was born a prince of this empire, but not its designated heir. He was the son of Emperor Bindusara, but his mother was not the chief queen. Her name, according to some traditions, was Subhadrangi or Dharma, the daughter of a Brahmin. She was of a lower status than the mothers of Ashoka's many half-brothers, a fact that would have placed him at a distinct disadvantage in the viper's nest of the Pataliputra court. Buddhist legends, seeking to craft a compelling narrative, later claimed that court intrigue kept her and her son away from the emperor's immediate favor for many years. Physically, Ashoka was not said to possess the commanding presence of a classical hero. Later texts describe his skin as coarse and his appearance as unremarkable. This may be a literary device to contrast his inner fire with an unimpressive exterior, or it may reflect a simple truth. In a world where royal authority was often linked to physical prowess and appearance, this could have been another spur to his ambition, a need to prove his worth through action rather than by birthright or looks. What he did possess was a formidable intellect and an unyielding will. His education would have been steeped in the traditions of Mauryan statecraft. From a young age, he would have studied the Arthashastra, not as a piece of philosophy, but as an operational manual for power. He learned that a king must be ever vigilant, that suspicion was a tool of survival, and that the state's security trumped all other concerns. He would have been trained rigorously in the arts of war, mastering the bow, the sword, and the chariot. He would have studied logistics, strategy, and the command of vast armies. A Mauryan prince was not raised to be a philosopher. He was forged into a weapon of the state, an instrument for its preservation and expansion. It was clear to his father, Bindusara, that Ashoka possessed exceptional abilities. To test and utilize his talented but potentially troublesome son, the emperor appointed him as the viceroy, or Uparaja, of the province of Avanti, a crucial and strategic region in the western part of the empire. Ashoka's provincial capital was the ancient and prosperous city of Ujjain. This was no sleepy backwater. Ujjain was a vital nexus of commerce, situated on the major trade routes that connected the Ganges Valley heartland with the western seaports of Barigaza and Sopara. From here, goods flowed to the markets of the Hellenistic West and the Arabian Peninsula. Governing Avanti was a masterclass in imperial administration. Ashoka was responsible for maintaining law and order, collecting taxes from the region's rich agricultural lands, overseeing trade, and commanding the local military garrison. He would have dealt with powerful merchant guilds, diverse religious communities, and the complex social fabric of a cosmopolitan trading hub. It was here that he demonstrated his talent for governance. He proved to be a capable and efficient administrator, and the province prospered under his rule. His time in Avanti was also personally significant. In the nearby town of Vidisha, he met and married a woman named Devi. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant and a devout Buddhist. This marriage was unusual for a prince of the blood. It was not a political alliance with another royal house, but a union with a commoner from the rising mercantile class. It may well have been a marriage of love, a rare luxury for royalty. Devi would not follow Ashoka to the imperial capital when he became emperor, but she was the mother of his first two children, a son named Mahinda and a daughter named Sangamita. Their mother's faith would have a profound, if delayed, influence on their lives, and through them on the course of history. While Ashoka was proving his mettle in Ujjain, trouble was brewing in the empire's far northwest. In the great university city of Taxila, a major rebellion erupted. Taxila was a notoriously restive province, a frontier region with a proud independent spirit. The revolt was not against the empire itself. but against the corrupt and oppressive local Mauryan officials who governed it. Emperor Bindusara first dispatched his eldest son and heir apparent, Susima, to quell the uprising. However, Susima was arrogant and inept. His high-handed approach only inflamed the situation, and he failed to restore order. With his chosen heir having failed, Bindusara turned to his most capable son. He sent word for Ashoka to leave Ujjain and march on Taxila. The legends surrounding this event are telling. They claim that Ashoka was sent without an adequate army or equipment, a sign perhaps of courtly machinations to see him fail. But his reputation preceded him. As his forces approached Taxila, the citizens themselves are said to have come out to greet him, proclaiming that they were not against the emperor, but only against the wicked ministers who abused his name. Ashoka entered the city without a major battle, pacified the region, and restored Mauryan authority with a skill and diplomacy his brother utterly lacked. This success dramatically increased his prestige within the empire and marked him as a man of destiny, a stark contrast to the failing heir, Susima. Around 273 before Common Era, the long reign of Bindusara came to an end. The emperor's death was the signal for the war of succession that many in the court had likely seen coming. The Mauryan throne was not a simple inheritance. It was a prize to be seized. The chief claimant was the crown prince, Susima. However, he was unpopular with the imperial council of ministers, who saw him as arrogant and incompetent. Their support swung to the prince who had proven his ability in both administration and war, Ashoka. The key figure in this political maneuvering was the prime minister, a man named Radhagupta, who saw in Ashoka the best hope for the empire's continued stability. What followed was a brutal 4-year struggle for power. The historical details are sparse, but later Buddhist chronicles paint a lurid picture to emphasize the cruelty of the man who would later become their faith's greatest champion. The Sri Lankan text, the Mahavamsa, claims that Ashoka, the slayer of his foes, killed 99 of his own half-brothers, leaving only his full brother Tissa alive. While the number is almost certainly an exaggeration, a rhetorical device to underscore his wickedness, the core of the story is plausible. A war of succession, in an empire of this nature, would have been a merciless affair. Contenders for the throne could not be left alive to foment future rebellions. Ashoka, with the backing of the ministerial council and key elements of the army, systematically hunted down and eliminated all rival claimants. Susima, the heir apparent, was reportedly lured into a pit of burning charcoal and killed. This bloody interregnum explains the curious 4-year gap between Ashoka's seizure of power in Pataliputra around 273 before Common Era and his formal coronation, or Abhiseka, which took place only in 269 before Common Era. Those 4 years were a period of civil war and consolidation. He had to purge the court of his brother's supporters, secure the loyalty of provincial governors across the vast empire, and crush any remaining pockets of resistance. He had to demonstrate through overwhelming force that he was the absolute and undisputed master of the Mauryan state. When he was finally consecrated as the third Mauryan emperor, it was not by right of birth, but by right of conquest. He had won his empire not from a foreign enemy, but from his own family. The man who emerged from this crucible of fratricidal warfare was hard, cynical, and ruthless. In the early years of his reign, he governed precisely as his grandfather had, and as Chanakya's Arthashastra prescribed. This was the era of Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. He was known for his violent temper and his cruelty. The state's vast network of spies was strengthened. The law was applied with brutal severity. Dissent was not tolerated. Legends from this period abound, likely embellished but reflecting the popular perception of his character. The most famous is the story of Ashoka's Hell. According to Buddhist accounts, the emperor ordered the construction of an elaborate and beautiful palace near the capital. It was filled with exquisite gardens, pleasant pools and wondrous decorations, but it was a facade. Inside, the palace was a meticulously designed torture chamber, filled with horrific instruments for inflicting pain and death. A cruel executioner was put in charge, with orders that no one who entered the gates should ever be allowed to leave alive. Criminals, rebels, and even innocent people who accidentally strayed inside were subjected to unspeakable torments. This tale, whether true or not, served as a powerful allegory for Ashoka's early rule, an empire that was prosperous and orderly on the surface, but whose peace was maintained through terror and violence. Under Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire reached its territorial zenith. He inherited a superpower and made it stronger. The administrative machine created by Chandragupta and maintained by Bindusara was now under the control of a man with boundless energy and ambition. The army was well-trained, loyal, and seemingly invincible. The economy, based on agricultural surpluses and control of continental trade routes, generated immense wealth for the state treasury. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the plains of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the Deccan Plateau, the word of the emperor in Pataliputra was law. It was an empire of unparalleled size and strength. Yet one piece of the puzzle remained missing. On the eastern coast, nestled between the mouths of the Mahanadi and Godavari rivers, lay the kingdom of Kalinga, corresponding to modern-day Odisha. Kalinga had been conquered by the Nanda dynasty before Chandragupta, but had since reasserted its independence. It was a rich and powerful kingdom in its own right. Its people were proud and had a strong martial tradition. Its fertile lands produced agricultural surpluses, and its forests were a source of valuable timber and elephants. Most importantly, Kalinga controlled a long and strategic coastline, dotted with ports that dominated the maritime trade routes across the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia. For the Mauryan Empire, which was largely landlocked, Kalinga's control of this sea trade was a significant economic and strategic issue. Furthermore, its continued independence was an affront to the Mauryan doctrine of universal empire, a direct challenge to the emperor's claim to be the sole sovereign of the subcontinent. For an emperor like Ashoka, a man who had killed his own brothers for the throne and who ruled with an iron fist, the existence of a free and prosperous Kalinga on his doorstep was intolerable. It was a threat to be neutralized, a prize to be taken. The conquest of Kalinga was the logical and perhaps inevitable next step in the fulfillment of the Mauryan imperial dream. In the 8th year after his coronation, around 261 before Common Era, Emperor Ashoka assembled the imperial army. The vast legions of infantry, the powerful cavalry wings, and the terrifying divisions of war elephants marched east. The objective was clear: the complete subjugation of Kalinga. The empire was at the peak of its power, and its ruler was a seasoned, ruthless commander. No one could have predicted that this campaign, intended as the final, brutal chapter of Mauryan expansion, would instead become the catalyst for one of the most profound transformations in human history. The war for Kalinga would give Ashoka his final victory, but it would cost him his soul, only to help him find a new one. The Mauryan war machine, perfected over 3 generations, was a terrifying spectacle of organized power. In the 8th year of his reign, Ashoka unleashed it upon Kalinga. Legions of infantry, their shields and spears bristling under the sun, marched in disciplined columns. Thousands of cavalry, the eyes and ears of the army, fanned out across the plains, and at their heart were the empire's ultimate weapon, the war elephants. Numbering in the thousands, these armored behemoths, with towers on their backs, carrying archers and spearmen, were the living tanks of the ancient world, bred to smash through enemy lines and spread terror. This was the force that had crushed rebellions, conquered the Deccan, and held the Hellenistic successor states at bay. Now its full might was directed at one final, defiant kingdom. The people of Kalinga knew the stakes. This was not a war for territory or tribute. It was a war for their very existence as an independent people. They marshaled their own formidable army and prepared to defend their homeland. The resistance the Mauryan forces encountered was ferocious. The war was not the swift surgical campaign Ashoka might have expected. It was a bloody, full-scale conflict of immense brutality. The fields and villages of Kalinga became a great killing ground. Armies clashed in pitched battles, the air filled with the screams of men and the trumpeting of elephants. Cities were besieged, starved into submission, and then sacked. The conflict dragged on, consuming. Finally, the superior numbers, resources, and organization of the Mauryan Empire prevailed. Kalinga's armies were broken, its cities captured, its leadership eliminated. Ashoka had his victory. He had succeeded where his father and grandfather had not. He had erased the last major independent kingdom from the map of the subcontinent, completing the imperial project of unification. By the cold, hard logic of the Arthashastra, the war was a resounding success. Sometime after the fighting had ceased, the victorious emperor came to survey his newly conquered territory. What he saw changed him, and the course of history, forever. The landscape was one of utter devastation. He did not see a glorious conquest. He saw a charnel house. The banks of the Daya River, which flowed through the heart of Kalinga, were said to have run red with the blood of the slain. The fields were littered with the bodies of soldiers from both sides. Vultures and stray dogs gorged on the dead. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the smoke of burning villages. The human cost was catastrophic. In his own words, which he would later have carved into stone for all to see, Ashoka recorded the numbers with stark precision. 100,000 people were killed in the fighting. 150,000 were carried away as captives, their lives shattered, destined for slavery or forced resettlement in other parts of the empire. And many times that number, he noted, perished afterwards from famine, disease, and the utter collapse of their society. He had not just defeated an army, he had annihilated a civilization. As he moved through the ruins, the emperor was confronted by the reality of his actions. He saw the weeping of women who had lost their husbands, the vacant stares of children who had lost their parents. He saw the bodies of Brahmins and holy men, people who were supposed to be inviolable. He saw the fabric of a whole society torn to shreds. Every death, every tear, every shattered life was a direct consequence of his ambition, of his order to invade. The abstract calculus of statecraft, the cold logic of conquest, dissolved in the face of this overwhelming human suffering. A profound crisis of conscience seized him. The victory felt like ashes in his mouth. In his 13th major rock edict, he would later publicly confess his state of mind. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods and weighs heavily on his mind. He felt a piercing regret. The physical conquest was complete, but it was a spiritual defeat. The immense suffering he had inflicted upon others now became his own. The ruthless conqueror, Ashoka, died on the battlefields of Kalinga, overwhelmed by the horror of what he had done. Haunted by this remorse, Ashoka returned to Pataliputra, a changed man. The principles of the Arthashastra that had guided his life now seemed hollow and bankrupt. A policy that led to such misery could not be the right path. He began a period of intense spiritual seeking, searching for a new philosophy to guide his rule and expiate his guilt. He consulted with thinkers from the many religious traditions flourishing in his empire. He spoke with Brahmin priests, Jain ascetics, and followers of other sects. He was looking for an answer, a new way to understand his power and his duty as a ruler. It was in the teachings of the Buddha that he found the path he was searching for. He encountered Buddhist monks whose message of compassion, karuna, nonviolence, ahimsa, and mindfulness resonated with his tormented conscience. The Buddhist doctrine that all life is suffering, caused by craving and aversion, seemed to explain the catastrophe he had unleashed. The Buddha's prescription, the Eightfold Path, offered a way out of this cycle of suffering, a way based not on ritual or birth, but on ethical conduct and mental discipline. The idea that a king's duty was not merely to conquer and rule, but to protect and nurture all living beings was a revelation. It offered him a framework for redemption. His conversion was not an overnight event. According to his own edicts, for about a year after the Kalinga War, he was in a state of turmoil. He then became a lay disciple, an upasaka, of the Buddhist faith. For the next 2.5 years, he did not, as he put it, exert himself strenuously. He was learning, studying, and gradually integrating the new philosophy into his worldview. But then, a deeper change took hold. He became a zealous proponent of the faith, visiting the Buddhist holy sites, associating closely with the monastic community, Sangha, and committing himself fully to living and ruling by its principles. This personal transformation led to a revolution in state policy. Ashoka renounced aggressive warfare, the very foundation upon which his family's empire had been built. He declared that the sound of the war drum would be replaced by the sound of the drum of Dhamma. He formulated a new imperial ideology, which he called Dhamma-vijaya, conquest by righteousness. He proclaimed that true victory was not achieved by the sword, but by winning the hearts and minds of people through moral persuasion. In Rock Edict 13, he declared that his new conquests would be in the lands of the Greek kings to the west, and in the kingdoms of southern India and Sri Lanka, but these would be conquests of peace, achieved by sending envoys to spread his message of Dhamma. To disseminate this message, Ashoka began a public works project of unprecedented scale and purpose. He commanded his officials to inscribe his new philosophy on great pillars of polished sandstone and on rock faces in prominent locations throughout his empire. These are the famous edicts of Ashoka, the first written evidence of Buddhism and a unique window into the mind of this extraordinary ruler. The pillars, often over 15 meters high and weighing 50 tons, were engineering marvels, quarried hundreds of kilometers away and transported across the empire. They were topped with magnificent animal capitals, the most famous being the 4 lions of Sarnath, which is now the official emblem of modern India. The inscriptions themselves were a direct communication from the emperor to his people. Written in local Prakrit dialects using the Brahmi script and in Greek and Aramaic on the western frontiers, they were intended to be read aloud to the illiterate majority. They were not religious dogma, but a code of ethical conduct for all his subjects, regardless of their faith. The edicts laid out the core principles of what Ashoka called Dhamma. Dhamma was not Buddhism itself, but a universal moral law inspired by its tenets. It included reverence for parents, elders, and teachers, proper treatment of servants and slaves, generosity to friends, acquaintances, and holy men, and most radically, non-injury to all living beings. Ashoka restricted the slaughter of animals for the royal kitchens and discouraged sacrificial rituals. He promoted religious tolerance, explicitly stating that no one should honor their own religion by disparaging another's. He was transforming the very definition of kingship. The emperor was no longer just a conqueror and a tax collector. He was now a paternal figure, responsible for the welfare of his subjects, whom he called his children. He appointed a new class of officials, the Dhamma-mahamatas, or officers of Dhamma, whose job was to travel the empire, promote righteous conduct, ensure the fair administration of justice, and alleviate the suffering of the people. He invested state funds in public works for the common good, planting banyan trees for shade along roads, digging wells, establishing medical facilities for both humans and animals, and opening botanical gardens to cultivate medicinal herbs. The Kalinga War was the pivot upon which his reign and his life turned. It was an event of such profound horror that it shocked the world's most powerful man into a new state of consciousness. He had achieved the ultimate military victory and found it to be a spiritual and moral dead end. In his remorse, he turned away from the path of violence and forged a new one based on compassion and peace. The ruthless emperor, Ashoka, was gone. In his place stood Dhamma-mahamatas, Ashoka the righteous. He was about to embark on the greatest campaign of his life. Not the conquest of territory, but the conquest of suffering. The golden age of the Mauryas was about to begin. The renunciation of war did not mean the abdication of power. Ashoka remained the absolute monarch of a vast and complex empire, but he now wielded that power for an entirely new purpose. The guiding philosophy of the state was no longer the ruthless pragmatism of the Arthashastra, but the ethical framework of Dhamma. His goal was to build what he called a welfare state, to rule not by fear, but by righteousness, and to act as a father and protector to his subjects. He expressed this new relationship in his edicts, declaring, "All men are my children, as I desire for my own children that they should have peace and happiness both in this world and the next, so I desire for all men." This was a revolutionary concept of kingship. To translate this grand vision into practice, Ashoka created an entirely new class of imperial officials, the Dhamma-mahamatas, or the great officers of Dhamma. These were not soldiers, spies, or tax collectors. They were agents of social welfare and moral persuasion. Their creation, in the 13th year of his reign, was a cornerstone of his new administration. Their mandate was unprecedented. They were instructed to travel throughout the empire, not just in the major cities but in the remote provinces, among all sects and social classes, from the Brahmins and nobles to the poorest servants and slaves. Their primary function was to promote the principles of Dhamma. This included encouraging kindness, generosity, and respect for elders, while discouraging cruelty, anger, and envy. However, their duties were also intensely practical. They were charged with overseeing the correct distribution of state-sponsored charity. Additionally, they were responsible for the welfare of prisoners, working to secure the release of those unjustly confined and providing aid to the families of those in prison. Furthermore, they were tasked with protecting the vulnerable, including the elderly, the orphaned, and the destitute. These officers acted as a direct link between the emperor and the common people, reporting back to Pataliputra on the successes and failures of the new policy and ensuring the emperor's paternalistic vision was being implemented on the ground. It was an administration of compassion, an attempt to weave morality into the very fabric of the state bureaucracy. Ashoka's focus on public welfare manifested in a massive program of public works. The excellent Mauryan road network, built for the swift movement of armies and trade, was repurposed for the comfort of the common traveler. Ashoka ordered shade trees, particularly banyan and mango groves, to be planted along all major highways. Wells were dug at regular intervals, providing water for people and their animals. Rest houses for travelers, known as dharmashalas, were constructed, offering shelter and safety. These initiatives were a physical expression of the state's new role. They were not just infrastructure, they were acts of institutionalized kindness, designed to make the lives of ordinary people easier and safer. His most radical innovation was in the field of public health. Ashoka established what may have been the world's first state-sponsored system of medical care. He ordered the construction of centers for medical treatment for both humans and, remarkably, for animals. This institutional concern for the health of non-human beings was a direct application of the principle of ahimsa and was unparalleled in the ancient world. To support this system, he commanded the establishment of botanical gardens. These were not for pleasure, but for the cultivation and distribution of medicinal plants, herbs, and roots. By making these remedies widely available, he was creating a form of public pharmacy, ensuring that healing was not solely the preserve of the wealthy. The concept of Dhamma also extended to the administration of justice. Ashoka inherited a harsh penal system, with punishments ranging from fines and mutilation to execution. While he did not abolish this system entirely, he sought to moderate its application with principles of fairness and compassion. He called for sammata, or uniformity, in judicial proceedings and punishments, ensuring that justice was not arbitrary. In one of his pillar edicts, he expresses his desire that his officials, the Rajukas, act with impartiality and without anger. Most strikingly, he introduced a 3-day moratorium for prisoners who had been condemned to death. This period of grace allowed the condemned time to make meritorious donations to secure a better afterlife, or it provided an opportunity for their relatives to make a final appeal for clemency. It was a small but significant injection of humanity into a brutal system. Nowhere was the principle of ahimsa, or non-injury, more clearly implemented than in his policies towards animals. Ashoka, the great hunter of his youth, now completely forbade the royal hunt. He also moved to restrict the practice of animal sacrifice, a central rite of the orthodox Brahmanical religion. This was a bold and potentially controversial move, challenging deeply entrenched religious traditions. He published lists of protected species, including parrots, wild geese, turtles, and many others, creating perhaps the first state-sanctioned wildlife protection acts in history. Even his own household was not exempt. He famously recorded that while previously many hundreds of thousands of animals were killed each day for the imperial kitchens, he had reduced this number to just 2 peacocks and 1 deer, and in the future, not even these 3 creatures will be killed. Crucially, Ashoka's personal devotion to Buddhism did not translate into intolerance for other faiths. In a pluralistic empire, filled with dozens of competing sects and philosophies, religious conflict was a constant threat to stability. Ashoka's Dhamma actively promoted interfaith harmony. In his 12th major rock edict, he lays out his policy with perfect clarity. He declares that he honors all sects, both ascetics and householders, with gifts and various forms of recognition. But he stresses that the true essence of religion is restraint in speech. One should not honor only one's own sect and condemn the sects of others. On the contrary, other sects should be honored for this reason and that. By so doing, one helps one's own sect to grow and benefits the sects of others too. This was not just passive tolerance, it was an active call for mutual respect and dialogue, a remarkably enlightened policy for any era. As a patron of his own faith, Ashoka's impact was immense. Around the year 250 before Common Era, he convened the Third Buddhist Council in his capital, Pataliputra. For centuries, different interpretations of the Buddha's teachings had emerged, leading to schisms and disputes within the monastic community, the Sangha. Ashoka, as the temporal protector of the faith, sponsored this great assembly to address these issues. Under the guidance of the elder monk Moggaliputta Tissa, the council worked to purify the Sangha by expelling heretical and corrupt monks and to establish an orthodox canon of the Buddha's teachings. The doctrines ratified at this council would become the foundation of the Theravada school of Buddhism, which remains the dominant tradition in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia today. Perhaps Ashoka's most far-reaching initiative grew out of this council. With the doctrine now clarified and unified, he embarked on the most ambitious part of his Dhamma-vijaya policy, spreading the message beyond the borders of his empire. He dispatched missions of monks and royal envoys to proselytize the Buddhist faith. This was not a campaign of conversion by the sword, but of persuasion by teaching. The scale of this enterprise was global. The most successful and best documented of these missions was to the island of Sri Lanka. Ashoka sent his own son, the monk Mahinda, to lead the delegation. Mahinda met the Sri Lankan king Devanampiya Tissa on a hilltop at Mihintayil and preached the Buddha's teachings. The king and his court converted, and Buddhism was established as the national faith of the island. A few years later, Ashoka sent his daughter, the nun Sanghamita, to Sri Lanka, carrying with her a sapling from the original Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. That sapling was planted in the royal capital of Anuradhapura, and its descendant, the Jaya Sri Mahabodhi, is still venerated today as the oldest historically authenticated tree in the world. His edicts record missions sent much further afield. He names the Hellenistic kings of the West as recipients of his Dhamma envoys: Antiochus II of the Seleucid Empire in Syria, Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt, Antigonus II Gonatas of Macedonia, Magas of Cyrene in modern Libya, and Alexander II of Epirus in Greece. While it is unlikely these missions resulted in any mass conversions and may have been perceived by the Greeks as little more than diplomatic embassies, they represent a remarkable moment of cultural outreach. For the first time, an Eastern philosophy was being actively and peacefully promoted in the heartlands of Western civilization. Other missions were sent east to regions of Southeast Asia which would later become strongholds of the Buddhist faith. For nearly 3 decades, Ashoka ruled over this empire of Dhamma. It was an era of unparalleled peace and prosperity. The immense resources of the state, once dedicated to war and conquest, were now redirected towards public welfare, social justice, and moral upliftment. He had attempted to create a true righteous kingdom, a state that functioned on the principles of compassion and non-violence. He had used his absolute power to try and make his people and the world better. It was a sublime and audacious experiment in governance, but it was an experiment held together by the will of one extraordinary man. The question that shadowed this golden age was whether such a uniquely personal vision could outlast its creator. The Empire of Dhamma was a magnificent, unprecedented experiment in ethical governance. For 3 decades, it brought peace and prosperity to the subcontinent. However, it was an empire built on the personal vision of one man, and its foundations were perhaps less stable than they appeared. The very policies that defined Ashoka's golden age may have contained the seeds of its rapid decline. An empire forged and maintained by the sword cannot easily lay its weapon down. The Mauryan state was, at its core, a military machine. Its vast army had not only conquered the subcontinent, but also served as the ultimate guarantor of internal order and the protector of its frontiers. Ashoka's policy of renouncing aggressive war was a moral triumph, but it may have been a strategic blunder. With no new conquests to provide plunder, land for veterans, and a clear sense of purpose, the enormous military establishment would have been a huge drain on the treasury. Morale among the generals and soldiers, trained for generations in a tradition of martial glory, likely withered. The army, once the sharpest instrument of the state, may have begun to rust. This neglect would have serious consequences, particularly along the vulnerable northwestern frontier, where new powers were rising in the Greek-ruled kingdom of Bactria. Ashoka's grand projects were also immensely expensive. The construction of thousands of stupas and monasteries, the engraving of edicts on pillars and rocks across the subcontinent, the salaries of the new Dhamma-mahamatas, the extensive public works, and the lavish donations to various religious sects, especially the Buddhist Sangha, placed a tremendous strain on the imperial economy. For decades, the Mauryan treasury had been filled by the efficient and often ruthless collection of taxes and the spoils of war. Now, expenditure was increasing dramatically while a key source of revenue, conquest, had been eliminated. Some archaeological evidence points to a debasement of the currency during the later Mauryan period, with silver coins showing a lower purity. This suggests an economy under significant pressure, a state struggling to pay for its own benevolence. Furthermore, the implementation of Dhamma, while well-intended, may have been a source of friction. The Dhamma-mahamatas, the emperor's agents of morality, were given broad powers to intervene in the lives of the populace. They were tasked with promoting virtue and correcting injustice, but such authority could easily have been perceived as intrusive and overbearing. A new layer of bureaucracy, empowered to police the ethical conduct of the people, may have caused widespread resentment, undermining the very harmony it was meant to create. The most powerful opposition, however, came from the Brahmanical establishment. Ashoka's policies struck at the very heart of their religious authority, social standing, and economic well-being. His official condemnation of many animal sacrifices, a central and lucrative ritual for the Brahmin priesthood, was a direct attack on their religious function. His ethical system of Dhamma was universal, available to all people regardless of their caste, which implicitly challenged the divinely ordained social hierarchy that placed Brahmins at the pinnacle. His personal patronage of Buddhism, elevating it in prestige and showering its monasteries with wealth, was seen as a direct threat to their own influence. For generations, the Brahmins had been the traditional spiritual advisors to kings and the custodians of knowledge. Ashoka had largely replaced them with Buddhist monks and a new secular morality. This created a powerful, educated, and deeply entrenched elite who were profoundly hostile to the Ashokan revolution. The last years of Ashoka's long reign are shrouded in legends that hint at a decline in his authority and a palace rife with intrigue. Buddhist texts tell a poignant, perhaps allegorical story of his final days. They speak of a younger queen, Tishyaraksha, who became jealous of the Bodhi tree and tried to have it poisoned. They tell of court officials and even Ashoka's own grandson, Samprati, growing alarmed at the emperor's ceaseless and extravagant donations to the Buddhist Sangha. In this telling, they conspired to curtail his power, seizing control of the imperial treasury and stripping the aged emperor of his administrative authority. The once mighty ruler of the subcontinent was reduced to a figurehead in his own palace. The most famous of these tales claims that, on his deathbed, the only possession Ashoka had left to give was half of a myrobalan fruit, which he solemnly donated to the Sangha as his final offering. While historically uncertain, these stories reflect a perception that the great emperor's power had waned and that forces hostile to his vision were already gathering in the shadows. Ashoka the Great died around 232 before Common Era after a reign of nearly 40 years. His death removed the single charismatic force that had held the entire enterprise of Dhamma together. The empire that had seemed so monolithic and stable immediately fractured. There was no clear successor, or perhaps there were too many. The sources are confusing and contradictory, suggesting the empire was immediately divided among his sons and grandsons. One son, Kunala, may have ruled the western provinces, while another grandson, Samprati, controlled the east from Pataliputra. Another figure, Chalauka, is said to have carved out an independent kingdom in Kashmir. The central authority that had been the bedrock of Mauryan power for over a century simply dissolved. The 50 years that followed Ashoka's death were a period of rapid and irreversible decline. A succession of obscure and short-lived rulers occupied the throne in Pataliputra, but their effective authority extended little beyond the old heartland of Magadha. Provincial governors, no longer held in check by a strong central command, became de facto independent kings. The great Mauryan army, neglected and leaderless, was incapable of holding the state together. The frontiers crumbled. In the northwest, the Greco-Bactrian kings, descendants of Alexander's soldiers, saw their opportunity. They swept down through the Hindu Kush passes, conquering Afghanistan and the Punjab, lands that had been part of the Mauryan Empire for over a century. In the south, the Satavahana dynasty rose in the Deccan, establishing a powerful new empire. The political unity of India, Ashoka's greatest inheritance, was shattered. The final end of the Mauryan dynasty came not from an external invader, but from a coup at the very heart of what little remained of the empire. Around 185 before Common Era, less than 50 years after Ashoka's passing, the last emperor, Brihadratha, was presiding over a military parade. As he reviewed his troops, his own commander-in-chief, his Senapati, a Brahmin named Pushyamitra Shunga, stepped forward and assassinated him in full view of the army. The soldiers, and presumably the court, offered no resistance. Pushyamitra seized the throne, establishing the Shunga dynasty and bringing the illustrious history of the Mauryas to a final ignominious end. The collapse was as swift as it was total. Historians have long debated the causes. The over-centralization of the empire, which relied too heavily on the character of the ruler, was clearly a factor. After Ashoka, a series of weak kings led to systemic failure. But it is impossible to ignore the role of Ashoka's own unique policies. Did his doctrine of non-violence leave the empire militarily unprepared for the challenges that followed his death? Did his vast spending on religious and social projects bankrupt the state? Did his challenge to the Brahmanical order create a fifth column that ultimately brought the dynasty down? The actions of the new Shunga dynasty are telling. Pushyamitra was a Brahmin, and his rise to power is often seen as a Brahmanical reaction or counter-revolution against the pro-Buddhist policies of the Mauryas. One of his first acts was to revive ancient and elaborate Vedic sacrifices, including the Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice, a grand ritual that only a great conqueror could perform. It was a clear and deliberate rejection of Ashokan ideals and a reassertion of orthodox Brahmanical tradition. The great Mauryan experiment was over. The empire of Dhamma had fallen, and with its fall, the memory of its greatest emperor, Ashoka, began to fade into the mists of legend. For nearly 2,000 years, the man who had ruled India and tried to conquer the world with peace would be all but forgotten. With the fall of the Mauryan dynasty, a curtain of silence descended upon the legacy of its greatest emperor. The new rulers, the Shungas, were champions of a Brahmanical revival. They had no reason to celebrate the memory of a king who had challenged their rituals, patronized Buddhism, and preached a doctrine of non-violence. Ashoka's name was systematically erased from the official chronicles and king lists. His revolutionary experiment in ethical governance was abandoned, dismissed as the failed policy of a bygone era. As the centuries passed and new empires rose and fell, the political unity he had forged became a distant memory. India returned to a familiar pattern of regional kingdoms, and the historical Ashoka, the ruler of a unified subcontinent, vanished from the memory of his own people. Yet, while he was forgotten by the political historians, he was sanctified by the religious storytellers. Ashoka's memory was kept alive and dramatically transformed within the Buddhist tradition. He became a central character in a body of literature known as the Avadanas, or legends, which were composed in the centuries following his death. The most famous of these are the North Indian Sanskrit text, the Ashokavadana, and the Sri Lankan Pali Chronicle, the Mahavamsa. These texts were not written as objective history. They were didactic tales, moral parables designed to illustrate the transformative power of the Buddha's teachings. To create the most dramatic possible story of conversion, they exaggerated both Ashoka's cruelty before and his piety after he embraced the faith. The historical Ashoka, the ruthless but pragmatic prince who fought a bloody war of succession, became the monstrous Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. This caricature was a villain of epic proportions who had killed 99 of his brothers, built an elaborate torture palace called Ashoka's Hell, and delighted in cruelty. His conversion after the Kalinga War was depicted as an instantaneous, miraculous event that turned a demon into a saint. In his new role as Dharma-shoka, Ashoka the Righteous, his virtues were equally magnified. He became the perfect Buddhist king, the ideal Chakravartin, or universal monarch, who rules the world not by force but by righteousness. The legends claim that he single-handedly built 84,000 stupas across the length and breadth of India in a single day, one for each atom of the Buddha's relics. He became the ultimate patron, the model of perfect kingship to which all subsequent Buddhist rulers should aspire. His story was no longer the complex biography of a man, but a powerful myth that served to inspire faith and legitimize the Buddhist religion for generations to come. Across India itself, the physical evidence of Ashoka's reign remained, silent and mysterious. His magnificent sandstone pillars stood sentinel over the plains, and his edicts were etched into rocks near ancient trade routes and pilgrimage sites. But the empire they represented was long gone. More importantly, the script in which they were written, Brahmi, had fallen out of use and evolved into the modern Indian scripts. Over time, the ability to read these ancient inscriptions was completely lost. For nearly 2,000 years, Ashoka's own words were indecipherable. People in later ages invented new stories to explain the strange pillars. Lacking any historical memory of the Mauryas, they attributed them to figures from mythology. The pillar in Delhi was known as Bhima's Lathi, the walking stick of the mighty Pandava hero from the epic Mahabharata. The inscriptions were regarded as magical charms or a form of esoteric code holding secret knowledge, their meaning lost to time. The name of the king who had them carved was utterly forgotten. The legendary Ashoka of the Buddhist tales and the historical king who left this vast stone archive were two separate figures, their connection completely severed. The rediscovery began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the arrival of European, particularly British, colonial officials. These men, a mix of administrators, soldiers, and scholars, brought with them a tradition of scientific inquiry and a deep curiosity about the history of the lands they now controlled. As part of the great intellectual project of mapping and understanding India, they began to systematically document its ancient monuments. They sketched the pillars, took impressions of the strange inscriptions, and speculated on their origins. But the script remained a tantalizing puzzle. The man who would finally solve the puzzle was James Prinsep, an assay master at the British Mint in Calcutta and the energetic secretary of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Prinsep was a brilliant polymath with a gift for decipherment. In the 1830s, he immersed himself in the study of ancient Indian scripts and coins. His first breakthrough came not from the pillars but from shorter inscriptions found on the gateway of the great stupa at Sanchi. He noticed these brief inscriptions often ended with a common phrase, danam, meaning gift. By comparing thousands of these donative inscriptions, he was able to correctly deduce the phonetic values for several Brahmi characters. It was a painstaking process of pattern recognition and logical deduction. He then turned his attention to the Great Pillar Edicts. He quickly recognized that the script was the same as the one at Sanchi. He also saw that the inscriptions on pillars thousands of kilometers apart from Delhi in the north to Bihar in the east were often identical. This meant they had been issued by the same powerful king. Applying his growing knowledge of the Brahmi alphabet, he was able to transliterate the text. He discovered that the edicts were written in a vernacular language, a Prakrit, and not the classical Sanskrit he had expected. He found a recurring phrase that appeared in nearly every edict, Devanampiya Piyadasi Laha Hevam Aha. He translated it, "Thus speaks the king, Devanampiya Piyadasi." He had found the king's name and title. The ruler who erected these monuments called himself Piyadasi, meaning he who regards all with affection, and Devanampiya, beloved of the gods. But this discovery only deepened the mystery. No king by that name was known from any Brahmanical or classical text. Who was this powerful, forgotten monarch? He was familiar with the Buddhist legends of a great Indian emperor who had converted to the faith and sent his son Mahinda to bring Buddhism to the island. The chronicle named this emperor Ashoka. Crucially, the chronicle also mentioned that Ashoka frequently used the title Piyadasi. In 1837, the connection was finally made. Turnur, published his findings, linking the legendary Ashoka of the Buddhist texts with the title Piyadasi. When James Prinsep read this, the puzzle pieces fell into place. The mysterious King Piyadasi of the Stone Edicts and the legendary Buddhist Emperor Ashoka were one and the same person. The memory preserved in the religious myths of Sri Lanka held the key to unlocking the historical record carved in the stones of India. It was a discovery of immense significance. The history of India was suddenly illuminated. Ashoka was no longer a semi-mythical figure from religious fables. He was a concrete historical emperor whose own words, thoughts, and policies could be read for the first time in 2 millennia. The decipherment of the Brahmi script pushed back the verifiable datable history of India by several centuries, providing a firm chronological anchor. The true scale of the Mauryan Empire, the names of the Greek kings Ashoka corresponded with, his unique philosophy of Dhamma, the story of his remorse after the Kalinga War, all of it came flooding back into the light of history. Ashoka was resurrected from obscurity. His legacy, once divided between a forgotten historical record and a distorted religious myth, was now reunified. The story of his rediscovery is as remarkable as the story of his reign. It demonstrates how completely a civilization can lose its memory, and how that memory can be painstakingly pieced back together through the patient work of scholarship. The emperor's message, etched in stone, had waited silently through the ages, outlasting his dynasty, his empire, and even his own name, until a future civilization finally learned to read it once more. The rediscovery of Ashoka in the 19th century was at first a purely academic pursuit. But in the early 20th century, as the movement for India's independence from British rule gained strength, the forgotten emperor was reborn as a potent political symbol. Leaders of the nationalist movement were searching for figures from India's past who could inspire a vision for a new, independent nation. They needed heroes who could represent a unified, pluralistic, and modern India. In Ashoka, they found a figure who seemed tailor-made for their cause. Here was a ruler who had presided over the first great pan-Indian empire, uniting the subcontinent under a single central authority. His historical reality was a powerful counter-narrative to the British colonial justification that India was an inherently divided land that required foreign rule to maintain order. Ashoka represented a golden age of Indian unity and strength. Furthermore, his personal faith was Buddhism, placing him outside the often fraught political dynamic between Hindus and Muslims. His explicit policy of religious tolerance, of respecting all faiths, provided a perfect historical precedent for the secular, multi-religious state the nationalist leaders hoped to build. His doctrine of ahimsa, or nonviolence, resonated powerfully with the cornerstone of Mahatma Gandhi's political philosophy. While Gandhi's nonviolence was a tool of civil disobedience born from a position of powerlessness, Ashoka's was a state policy enacted from the pinnacle of absolute power. This parallel, however imperfect, was inspiring. It suggested that nonviolence was not a sign of weakness, but a principle that could be espoused by the strong, an indigenous Indian ideal of ethical governance. No one was more instrumental in shaping this modern interpretation of Ashoka than Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister. A historian by inclination, Nehru was captivated by Ashoka's story. In his book, The Discovery of India, written while imprisoned by the British in the 1940s, Nehru portrayed Ashoka as an enlightened and visionary ruler, a man far ahead of his time. He saw in the Mauryan emperor a model of a leader who combined immense power with a profound moral purpose. He admired Ashoka's internationalism, his sending of envoys of peace and friendship to the far corners of the known world, and he celebrated his commitment to the welfare of the common people. For Nehru, Ashoka was proof that India had a rich tradition of secular, humane, and universalist governance to draw upon. When India achieved its independence in 1947, Nehru and the other founders of the new republic deliberately and consciously wove Ashokan symbolism into the fabric of the modern state. They sought symbols that were uniquely Indian, yet universal in their message, symbols that could unite a nation of immense diversity. For the national emblem of the Republic of India, they chose the capital of Ashoka's pillar at Sarnath. This was the very spot where the Buddha gave his first sermon, a site of immense historical and spiritual significance. The capital features 4 majestic lions facing the 4 cardinal directions, symbolizing power, courage, confidence, and vigilance. Below the lions is a frieze containing a wheel and the figures of a horse, a bull, an elephant, and a lion. The entire structure rests on an inverted lotus. This powerful image from the 3rd century before Common Era became the official seal of a 20th century democracy. The wheel, or chakra, from the base of the Sarnath capital was also given the place of honor in the center of India's new national flag. The 24-spoked Ashoka chakra, representing the eternal wheel of Dharma, or law, replaced the spinning wheel that had been the symbol of the Congress Party. This was a deliberate choice to adopt a symbol that represented the entire nation and its ancient heritage, a symbol of constant motion and progress. Every time the Indian flag is raised, the legacy of Ashoka is invoked. Today, historical analysis offers a more critical and nuanced perspective on Ashoka's reign. The hagiography of both the ancient Buddhist texts and the modern nationalist movement has given way to a more complex portrait. Historians now question the neat narrative of a purely spiritual conversion. While his remorse after Kalinga was undoubtedly genuine, his adoption of Dhamma may also have been a masterstroke of political pragmatism. A universal ethical code that transcended local traditions and religious affiliations was perhaps a more effective ideological glue for a vast multi-ethnic empire than any single religion would have been. The limits of his pacifism are also more clearly understood. Ashoka never disbanded his army. His edicts show that he renounced wars of conquest, but he was prepared to use force against rebellious forest tribes if they threatened the empire's stability. He deeply regretted the Kalinga War, but he never relinquished control of the territory he had conquered. His policy was a rejection of aggressive expansionism, not a complete abandonment of the state's coercive power. Some modern critics have even characterized his rule as a form of benevolent authoritarianism. The Dhamma-mahamatas could be seen as moral police, and the emperor's edicts, for all their humanity, were top-down pronouncements from an absolute monarch telling his subjects how they ought to live. Yet, these complexities do not diminish the scale of his achievement. In an age of routine brutality, he stands as a singular figure who grappled with the morality of his own power. His story continues to resonate in the 21st century, speaking to timeless questions of leadership, ethics, and the responsibility of the powerful. He is a constant reference point in discussions about the role of morality in international relations and a historical touchstone for the ideal of religious pluralism. Ashoka's journey is a story of profound transformation. He began as Ashoka, a ruthless emperor who was a perfect product of his time, a ruler who won his throne through fratricide and completed his empire through a devastating war. But the horrors of that war transformed him. He became Dhamma-ashoka, the righteous king, who dedicated the rest of his life and the immense resources of his state to a radical experiment in compassionate governance. His empire of Dhamma did not survive him. The political unity he had championed crumbled within 2 generations of his death. But the message he inscribed on pillars of stone endured. It survived 2,000 years of oblivion, waiting to be rediscovered. His ultimate legacy is not the empire he lost, but the ideal he articulated. This ideal would eventually provide the symbolic foundation for the modern nation of India. He remains a testament to the idea that a ruler's greatest victory is not over others, but over himself. and that the most enduring conquest is the one waged for peace.